Okay, welcome back, everyone. For those of you just joining us on the live stream or just walking into the room, I'll quickly reintroduce myself. My name is Ariel Ritchin. I'm senior producer here at the Dart Center, and I have the privilege of running the Dart Awards program from start to finish. I'm also an alum of the school. Anyway, I'm really excited to be up here with this incredible group of journalists. You all just saw a little bit about their work. And they're here to share some of their process with us, which we're all very lucky for. So I'm joined up here. I'll try to make this quick. There's a lot of us. Chris Benderev is representing NPR's Embedded podcast. Joe Mozingo from the LA Times. Claire Landsbaum is representing Vanity Fair. Zahara Gómez, Lucini, the Atavist. Interpreter Sonia Roman. Joe Sexton and Ed Yu from the Outlaw Ocean Project. So I'll talk a little bit. So we've seen and heard a little bit about each one of your projects in the video. A lot of people here have read, watched, or listened to your work. But I want to ask each of you to just briefly reintroduce us to your projects and tell us about how you decided to take them on and some of the challenges you encountered along the way. After you all get a chance to talk about that, I'll start with a few questions to get the conversation going, and then we'll open up to Q&A from the room. I'm sure there are a lot of questions there. So everyone, remember your questions, write them down. It'll happen all of a sudden. So Chris, I'm just going to go down the line this way. I want to start with you, but it's kind of unusual to be telling a story about trauma when the survivors of that traumatic event are also telling that story about the same traumatic incident. Can you talk about how you approach the story and why you think the Capital Gazette newsroom let you in when they said no to so many other people?
That is a good point. That is kind of what was, I guess, different about that particular shooting. It was different in a way, although there were definitely ways in which it made it harder to tell the story. I thought it would. These are people who are already articulating their own story. They're already having to write about it. So I know this sounds cynical of me, but I was like, oh, they're already articulating all their thoughts, and I can bring a microphone. It'll be that easy. And it wasn't quite as simple as that, but it was interesting to see them in the middle of writing about trying to cover their own anniversary of the shooting and trying to cover other things, trying to cover the trial of the shooter. You were saying why I had an interest in it. I think.
Well, I know they said no to CNN,
and why they
to
said
the New York
no.
Times, and they said yes to you. So how'd you do it?
Yeah, that one is just showing up. I live in D.C., which is not that far from Annapolis, and it took 9 months, maybe not quite that long, close to that long, of just showing up for off the record, coffees and explaining and writing up here's what we want to do. And also, honestly, actually, I had phone calls with Bruce Shapiro, who was actually very helpful in just how to approach it. And I don't know, I think there's it sounds almost cheesy, but there is a certain intangible value to showing up. And I think after you do it long enough, people are like, oh, you really, the editor of the Capitol, very nice, but a little bit of a grizzled journalist cliche, Rick Hutzel, just he was I think he was a little annoyed, but also a little touched that we showed up so much, and eventually kind of opened the door a little bit and a little bit more. So.
Thank you. Joe, you and Francine also had some time getting access. You showed up at Martin Luther King Junior Community Hospital, really at the height of COVID, and it was a dangerous time to be trying to do that kind of work as well. How did you, why did you think this story was so important to pursue, and how did you find some access?
Francine had been doing stories there for a while, and a reporter hadn't really gone in and spent a lot of time. It felt like I was reading stories about, oh my God, the hospitals are overflowing, people are dying, but I never viscerally connected with those stories or really could envision what was happening. I was kind of trying to fill in the image with a Army field hospital or something. So I said, I usually do long form narrative, and I thought, well, maybe I'll just go there and see if I can just hang out in the COVID ward and try to just see what I can find and try to make it more palpable for people to understand how horrific this disease is. And so Francine had good access. Luckily, the communication director knew my work well, so she was happy to let us just go in there. And at first, the problem was I realized why there hadn't been any really great stories is you get there and it's not chaos. It's quiet. Nurses are doing their job. The COVID patients are in their room. They're dead quiet, breathing, watching TV. And so I started interviewing nurses, doing what we do, interviewing everyone, and I was really kind of spinning my wheels trying to think of, like, I'm not really going to get anything new out of this situation. And then a couple hours in, we hear code blue on the 3rd floor. And the nurse says, you want to go see what that's about? Because at that point, the hospital's entirely COVID patients. And there's this 30-year-old man. He's like, they have to intubate him right now. And you could see through the window, he's just sitting in his bed, lying there, just shaking, talking to his girlfriend, saying goodbye, like just screaming, like, because he knows his intubation means you could likely die. That could be his last moment. He's saying goodbye. There's all these people with these huge hoods that look like aliens around him. The nurses were standing in the hall just, tearing up. I was tearing up. I mean, it was just seeing how alone that guy was at that moment, facing that decision, was just so unbelievable that it hit me. And then I still had to figure out how to do the story. So at lunch, we were starting to talk through it and talking through it with nurses, and we realized, everyone reaches that. Well, not everyone. All the severe cases reach that point where are you going to be intubated or not? And it's a decision you all have to make, and it's the most terrifying decision anyone could ever have to make, because you will never wake up again. So we decided they gave us such access that we found, we went up probably to a dozen people who were nearing that point, but still totally, able to speak, could understand everything, and basically approached them to see if we could follow them through as they either reached that point or got healthier. And it was a hard sell because they're like the most miserable in their life. They look terrible. And it's the first time I was almost trying to talk people down, by saying, you're going to be on the front page of the LA Times looking horrible. Because I wanted them to know. But many of them were so outraged by the denial about COVID at the time that they just said that, the world has to know how horrific this was. So we ended up just following 7 people, I think. And then we ultimately wrote about 3 through the process, kind of doing interweaving narrative.
Yeah. Claire, you were the project editor on the Vanity Fair piece. You already thanked Rita, who wrote a statement since she couldn't be here. Would you read that to us, and then we can talk about editing a little later?
Great, yeah, I would love to do that. Rita's a fantastic writer. Unfortunately, she has a scheduling conflict. She's in LA doing wheeling and dealing. So she sent this statement about what inspired her to embark on this project, basically. So I will read it to you. I will attempt to do her justice. She says, to commemorate George Floyd's first death anniversary, I set out to examine the lasting trauma in the Black community. My reporting focused in on the disproportionate rate of Black men killed at the hands of police officers. The writing made it clear that focusing on this demographic was intentional and did not discount the deaths of other races or genders killed by police. Of the 15 mothers featured in the project, they were sons. Some have become household names and significant figures of the movement against police violence. Gwen Carr, Valerie Bell, and Kadiatou Diallo, I set out to uncover what happened on the other side of tragedy for the growing number of families carrying this burden. How do they and their communities persevere? What are birthdays and Christmases and Thanksgivings like? Where do they channel their grief and anger? What does justice mean to them? What is in their self and soul care toolkit? My journalistic curiosity led me to these women. I had always wondered how surviving families, especially mothers of such tragedies, traverse the aftermath while becoming part of a movement they did not ask for. I most wanted to know what every morning and night felt like for them, because in them I saw my mother. She could have been one of these women. In 2005, my eldest brother was unjustly stopped and frisked by a police officer while attending school in upstate New York. My mother didn't sleep for months thinking about her baby boy locked in a cell. We were broke. No fancy lawyers came to our rescue. And soon enough, a green card holder, my brother was deported. Happy that he was a free man in Nigeria, my mother never pursued the case any further. She couldn't even if she wanted to. She had exhausted all her financial options. She kept her head down and persevered. My brother could easily have become another kind of statistic, the kind Gwen Carr, Valerie Bell, Kariatu Diallo, and countless mothers are forced to grapple with. That notion pressed on me harder as I watched George Floyd take his final breaths. I thought, what if my brother didn't survive his police encounter? Would Mom be forced to stand in front of flashing cameras and elongated microphones, seeking justice and accountability? How would she have carried on? The reporting took 6 months. I interviewed a total of 47 Black mothers before zeroing in on 15, mindful of showcasing varying regional perspectives. I also deliberately kept the story in the mothers' voices. For so long, these women were accustomed to being another quote or forceful soundbite, their words turned into catchphrases or summarized to fit a specific narrative. I wanted readers to engage directly with each mother's words, to read the hope they had in their sons' futures, to comprehend the persistent consequence of police violence, to grasp how one traumatic event can forever change the trajectory of many.
Thank you. Zahara, you and Annalise also worked on a story about mothers who often, their children were disappeared, their husbands were disappeared, they were killed in many cases. You had already worked with these women before you started reporting the story. Can you tell us a little bit about how the project came to be?
Just, I want to say thank you to have a wonderful translator, because I'm a little bit nervous, so I think it will be easier if I speak Spanish. Entonces, esto empieza. Vivo en México y desde el 2016
This begins with I live in Mexico, and as of 2016,
trabajo con colectivos de desaparecidos.
I work with groups that disappeared.
En México, oficialmente, hay más de 100,000 desaparecidos.
In Mexico, officially, there are more than 100,000 people disappeared.
Y mayoritariamente son las mujeres que se organizan para exigir justicia,
Mostly the women are the ones that organize themselves to demand justice,
pero también para buscarlos físicamente.
but also to go out and look for them physically.
Entonces, solo para el contexto, hoy México tiene más de 100 colectivos
So
de
just
familias,
For the context, today Mexico has more than 100,000 groups of families,
y uno de ellos son las rastreadoras del fuerte,
one of them are the trackers of El Fuerte.
que están en Sinaloa,
They are in Sinaloa,
y con quien yo trabajo desde el 2016, 2017.
and these are the ones that I've been working with since 2016, 2017.
Después de trabajar mucho, digamos, desde el periodismo clásico o fotografía clásica,
After working for a long period of time with what I would call classic journalism, classic photography,
sí encontré un problema grave de cómo se cuenta esta historia y cómo se puede invitar a la sociedad civil a ser parte.
I found a serious problem with how they are telling these stories and how we can have the civil society be a part of it.
Y en ese sentido, buscando formas y hablando mucho con ellas,
And in that sense, looking for ways and talking to them a lot,
les propuse hacer un proyecto en coautoría,
I proposed to do a project with them as co-authors,
que es el libro de recetas,
which is the recipe book,
donde cada una cocina el platillo preferido de su hijo,
where each one cooks the favorite platter of their sons
y explica cómo cocinarlo, ¿no?
and they also explain how to cook it, of course.
Y entonces hicimos un libro
So we made a book.
y meses después,
Months later,
Annalise me contactó
Annalise contacted me
con muchas ganas de hacer algo juntas también,
with a big desire to do something together as well.
y ahí apareció Seward de The Atavist,
That's when Seward from Altavist also appeared.
y fuimos a Sinaloa a trabajar,
We went to Sinaloa to work,
y yo les propuse en la misma continuidad a las tres de decir, bueno, cómo construimos una historia juntas.
And with the same continuity, I proposed the three of them and asked, how do we construct this story together?
Y con la ayuda de Lens
With the help of Lens.
y de ellas hicimos esta narrativa, ¿no?
And with their help, we made this narrative.
Thank you. Joe and Ed, the Outlaw Ocean Project, you were reporting on places that no one wants us to see, Libyan detention centers run by militias. Can you tell us a little bit about how you were able to bring us there and some of the challenges you encountered while trying to do that?
Sure. I thought I had come prepared. I have pages and pages of notes. But then I didn't realize I was going to encounter a fresh trauma myself, because 20 years ago, I desperately wanted to hire Joe Mozingo when I was deputy metro editor at the New York Times, and he got away. But so
Got away.
I've suffered from that ever since. But it's been a delight to see him make the Times regret it every day since. So, and talk about great names. How about Joe fucking Mozingo? Anyway, the idea of going to North Africa to report the really horrific story of what the European Union had wrought. The European Union, tired of actually accepting and trying to cope with floods of migrants from Africa and the Middle East, had decided it would outsource the dirty work of enforcement to, a broken country like Libya. And the disaster that has ensued is fully predictable, and the European Union is fully culpable. But the idea that we would go there and report on this could only have come from the fertile and fearless brain of Ian Urbina, who is the founder of the Outlaw Ocean Project. And it probably worth 10 seconds to say the origin story of the Outlaw Ocean Project. Ian was a reporter at the New York Times and did a spectacular series of stories a number of years ago under the rubric The Outlaw Ocean, about all of the misconduct and mystery and malfeasance that goes on the 2/3 of the planet that no one actually consistently covers. And it was a brilliant body of work, and he was approached by some organizations who were interested in funding more of that kind of reporting. So he, in a quite daring move, left the Times and founded the Outlaw Ocean Project. So he has a long history of, some of the most courageous and intrepid reporting. And, it could only have come from him that he would like, why don't we go to Libya? That's a cool place to report. And then our ambitions were, if we did our reporting in Libya, we would go on to Niger and cross the Sahara with migrants who were making their way from West Africa up to Libya and then to Europe, hopefully. We never made it to Niger. But for me, who's I've covered my share of trauma across the years, but I'm not a particularly brave person, and I don't really know quite how I said yes to Ian. I'm a Brooklyn boy who often finds it too scary to go to the Bronx. But one of the fundamental challenges, and I'll let Ed talk a little bit, who's a much more legit trauma reporter and who just dropped on me that he's just back from a month in Ukraine. But one of the challenging things for me was simply to understand the scope of the crimes. Barack, I told you, don't call me, man. Come on. I'm so sorry. Fucking Obama, he's got nothing to do. He's got to call me. Most of the traumatic events that I'd, been involved in covering were quite intimate, whether they were particular murder or, even on the grander scale of 9/11, when 3,000 people perished in 102 minutes downtown. This is tens of thousands of people being moved through these, what really can only be called the equivalent of concentration camps. And, just the enormity of the horror, it's quite intimidating, and like, how the hell are we ever going to tell or adequately tell that story? And we sort of settled on two things. One, Ed did some extraordinary reporting out on the Mediterranean, but we thought, well, we're going to tell the story of one African migrant who was shot to death inside the most notorious of the detention centers in Libya. From his birth through his decision to leave, to try to make it to Europe, to his capture on the Mediterranean, to his imprisonment at the detention center known as Al-Mabani. Maybe if you could set your ambitions to just tell one person's story, you might be able to get your head around how to actually do it. But on many levels, and Ian will probably get mad at me for saying this, it was a preposterous idea, I think. Libya is not a broken country. It's a violent place. Reporters don't go there, really. And to go there and then try to report on the most sensitive thing that, the Libyan militias were engaged in. God bless Ian for his courage, and I suppose God saved me from my own craziness to have said yes. But I'll let Ed talk a little bit about his experience.
So a lot of the reporting that I was doing is in the Mediterranean in a ship called the Gómez. So I was with this group that was intercepting and rescuing migrants as they made it across the border, across the Mediterranean. And so as a filmmaker, photojournalist, reporter, I think what was really interesting is that covering trauma, we spent a lot of time, or I spent a lot of time with these migrants at their worst moments, at their best moments. We met these people on these ships who had been at sea for 48 hours, 72 hours adrift. And so when we showed up on these ribs and this large ship to essentially save them, it was kind of the best moment of their life that they would realize that they were okay. And there was this refrain that the rescuers would say, which is like, "Inta amen, you're safe." And, seeing that was really amazing. But at the same time, too, as, based off the reporting from Libya, these migrants have been through some horrible things. And so people came from all over, from Bangladesh, from Sudan, from Syria. They made this incredible journey to get to Libya. A lot of them had been held in these detention centers where they were beaten and tortured and extorted. So by the time that I was covering them at the safety of the sea, while they were trying to figure out would they make it to Europe, would they be turned back, I was really struck by the universal language of trauma, that, there were dozens of languages. The only language I could speak to them is Arabic, but from Bangladeshis to Sudanese to people from all over, it felt like trauma and that hope, but also that contradiction needed no translation. And so I spent a lot of time, down on the decks for a week or 2 weeks with these people trying to kind of just understand like that landscape and that terrain of where hope meets despair. When I just find that when you're covering people who've been through traumatic events, they're not defined by just their trauma, they're defined by their hope. And so I found myself kind of like propped up between these two really specific feelings at any given time, that they were going to make it to Europe and hopefully they would be safe, but they would have to deal with everything that came before that. And it was actually quite difficult, but also it was quite inspiring.
Thank you. That makes me think of boundaries. We all are. When I report, when people in this room report, there's navigating the expectations of your sources you're working with, maintaining boundaries, people who run hot and cold, people who rely on you for help, for friendship sometimes, and then other times completely ghost you. For me, like, I'm wondering how you all, and anyone can jump in, we don't have to go up and down this line anymore, but how you navigate that experience with people who you're working with on this story and on others, how to maintain boundaries. I will call on someone if
I can talk about that.
okay, great.
I think so. As a filmmaker and as a visual person, we just have to be there. And I find that keeping boundaries with participants is quite difficult because you kind of want the whole landscape of their good days and bad days. And one major part of that is consent, is trying to figure out, like, is it okay for me to kind of be here with you on the worst day of your life or after this incredibly horrific moment? And I think the key thing is, like, if as a journalist you can portray the totality of someone, I think what I usually ask people is, like, can I be there at your best times but also your worst times? And you kind of, like, if you define them as a whole person other than whatever their trauma is, and you just show everything else, then you kind of, like, balance that out. And I think that's kind of the fair way to respect the people who we report on. And I think that's kind of like how you keep those boundaries and you just respect.
Yeah, I think, at least in our story and a lot of stories that we do, especially when there's no language barrier, just developing a rapport, really kind of in some ways taking off your reporter's hat and just getting a sense, is this person getting annoyed with my presence right now? Like, are they sick of me? I'm just hanging here for 4 hours. Do I really need to be here right now? It'd be better if I come back tomorrow. And just, it's really trying to read the person and always be thinking of what you need and what you don't need sometimes. You don't need to just tag along someone constantly. We were in and out of these hospital rooms. They couldn't talk very long. They had COVID, so they could, we would talk very briefly, let them breathe. In a lot of these cases, these people wanted to talk because they were so lonely in those rooms. But we had to go to their families to get most of it. And it was the same thing, just reading the body language and, just like you would if you're talking to anyone. Yeah.
I think any time I've ever been prepped for, like, going on TV or something by somebody, they'd say, well, don't answer the question, just say what you want to say. So, I don't know whether this is a direct answer to the question, but one thing I did want to say, and maybe to the young students here, is in terms, I think it's a boundary question. But we all are conditioned as reporters or journalists or whatever we want to call ourselves, that the mission is to get the story, right? To get the impossible interview. It's a badge of honor to say you got somebody who didn't want to talk. And that is well and good up to a point. But the ability to actually respect when people say no, that your career will survive that, and that person has the absolute inviolable right to say, I don't want to share with you my story. And the cost of that, if you push and don't respect that, can be great. And it's maybe a perhaps odd example, but one kind of appropriate for our setting here, right? So there was a disastrous Rolling Stone story done a number of years ago about a woman who said she had been gang raped at a fraternity on the University of Virginia's campus. And actually Steve Call, I think the U.S. just scored.
The Christmas lights went on, I think.
Steve Call actually did the investigation into what went wrong in that story, and it was a very thorough and damning autopsy. But I think what got lost in it is, if you go back and listen to that story, so the reporter was working with this woman, and at a certain point, she thought she had what she needed. She had the perfect victim, and the woman said to her, I don't want to go forward. And how much would have been spared had that reporter said, you know what? I don't know whether that's because she's fearful of telling her story, that she doesn't want to, or maybe that she's making it up, whatever. But the reporter wouldn't let go and strong-armed her into going forward with the story. And disaster happened. And so I just think, while it's a slightly unorthodox way of appreciating the point, if people say no, respect that, honor that. They're safer for it, and you likely are too.
Yeah.
Sí, perdón, yo creo que yo no estoy segura que se puedan poner realmente límites, o yo no trabajo así.
I'm sorry, I don't think you can really set borders, or at least I don't work that way.
Sobre todo cuando, no sé, buscas caminos colectivos,
Especially when I don't know you're looking for group paths.
los límites desaparecen,
These borders disappear.
porque es un diálogo permanente.
It's a permanent dialogue.
Y no estoy segura que haya gente que tenga la capacidad de decir no.
And I'm not sure if there are people that have the capability to say no.
Con los colectivos de desaparecidos,
With these groups have disappeared,
yo me di cuenta de algo, que muchos periodistas venían a trabajar con ellas,
I realized something, that a lot of journalists were coming there to work with them.
pero las entrevistas siempre eran las mismas preguntas.
But the interviews always consisted of the same questions.
Y evidentemente estas personas que están en una situación de muchísima vulnerabilidad
And it's evident that these people that are in a situation of so much vulnerability
y que buscan justicia, claro que quieren contar sus historias,
and they're seeking justice, of course they want to tell their stories.
pero creo que nosotros, tenemos que encontrar las formas de contarlas de otra manera.
But I think we have to find a way of telling these stories a different way.
Porque si siempre hacemos las mismas preguntas, siempre vamos a tener las mismas respuestas, ¿no?
If we always ask the same questions, we are always going to obtain the same answers.
Entonces, perdón, estando con ellas, me pasó que me di cuenta que siempre contaban la desaparición de su hijo de la misma manera, lloraban en el mismo lugar, y ya tenían un guión del trauma.
So I'm sorry, but being with these women, I realized that they always told the stories in the same way, they always cried in the same way, they already had a guide or a script to their trauma.
Involuntario, ¿no?
And
Evidentemente.
it was something that was involuntary, of course.
Y creo que eso sí es nuestro trabajo, y es difícil que alguien en esa situación de fragilidad pueda decir, uy, no quiero. A
And
veces no puede.
I believe that this is our job, and I think that the person being in that fragile condition sometimes can't. It's our job to do that.
Thank you. Claire, you had mentioned that Rita interviewed 57 people and you ended up with 15. Can you tell us, that's hard to do for people who tell you their story. So can you tell us a little bit about how you went about that process, deciding whose story would be in the end and how you communicated that?
Sure. So like I said, Rita, we had never worked together before, and this was the first story that she ever pitched me, and it kind of landed wholesale in my inbox, and it was remarkable. She's a fantastic writer, but she also loves, a bolded sentence in an email and like a bullet point, and it guides you well as an editor. And it's sort of reassuring too. You're like, okay, this person can do this thing that they're telling me they can do. She had done a tremendous amount of legwork already. She had built a lot of the relationships with these women because this was something that she was just wholesale interested in as a human. And we kind of went back and forth. It was an issue of volume. Like, you have to, as an editor, think about you want to do justice to these women who are speaking to you and being vulnerable with you, but you also need to engage a reader on a web page. So most digital journalism is about that balance. And so I was like, okay, what is feasible? And we really wanted to do photography with it too. So what is feasible with our budget? Not to take all the romance out of it, but what is feasible to do in terms of photography as well. So She had suggested, you know, all of them. She had suggested maybe 2 or 3. I didn't think that was enough. I wanted there to be kind of a middle ground where you'd be sort of hit with the force of hearing all of these stories one after the other on the page. So we settled on 15 for the sake of logistics and for the sake of storytelling, and I think that they worked well together. I wish she was here to tell you more about the interview process. You know, she got really close to a lot of these women and keeps in contact with many of them. And I just think what she did was remarkable.
Thanks. Another editing question for the other editor up here, Joe. You talked a little bit in your speech about the incident when you were the reporting team was detained. Can you talk about how you were able to incorporate that into the story and what challenges you maybe faced in trying to do that?
I'll try. I suppose just to give a little context to it. So there were a team of 4 of us who went to Tripoli, and we had been there about a week and done some quite, extraordinary and maybe reckless reporting. And we're only going to spend a couple more days likely there. And on a Sunday evening, Ian stayed back at the hotel. He had to FaceTime with his son to get some homework assignment done. And myself and the 2 other members of the team were in a van, and we went off to have dinner. So it was a very well-executed, simultaneous takedown. Ian was quite battered when he was masked and marched out in his bare feet from the hotel, and we wound up blindfolded and taken at gunpoint and held for 6 days incommunicado. Now I even forget what the question was.
How'd you put that into the story?
I will. So when we, and I want to be very careful here, right? Because of a risk of trying in some way, and we had to handle this in the story, of somehow equating our experience with, what the people who were held in these detention centers were going through, rape, torture, murder. We were spared all that. But the experience was enough, at least for me, I can only speak for myself. The thing that if I were to venture to say or dare to say that I had some experience of what the migrants were experiencing is, and I'm sure this is at the heart of trauma scholarship, the overwhelming feeling I had in our days of detention was shame. And it's kind of fascinating and kind of scary to have experienced how the psychology of detainment, the humiliations that come with it, engender shame on the people who are its victims. You blame yourself, you're embarrassed, the cost you've made your families pay. And I think for, the victims of much more horrific mistreatment, conquering that sense that shame is the thing that may stay with them longest after their, wounds have healed or their acute grief has passed. Shame is extraordinarily powerful and enduring thing. So when we first came back, we had no fucking intention of writing about our own detention. We didn't want it to be in the story. I didn't, there are people in my blood relatives who still don't know what happened. And I, for one, was just I'm just not gonna, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to write about it. It's not the fucking story. And we worked our way through several drafts and, got to a point in which both with a little distance from the experience and, where it seemed like a real utility that was true to the story. And, whatever little glimmer of the, gross mistreatment going on in Libya that we did experience lent a certain authority or integrity to the final story. So we agreed. It was very brief in the story. It happens very late in the story, and it is very modest. But we thought it was essential, and people may disagree.
Thanks. If people want to start lining up for questions, I'll ask one more for now, and that's Francine's speech directly to journalism students. What in Zahara, what you just said about maintaining boundaries being ridiculous in the first place, which I feel that too. What kind of advice would you give to people, or what do you wish you knew as a younger reporter starting up on what it's like to embark on these, in your case, 3-year-long project, and how to prepare for both the exposure to trauma and just what it takes out of you personally and professionally, if you'd share advice with people here. I'm going to call on Chris.
I'm still formulating my answer. I agree with it's a weird thing, the boundaries question. I wish I could explain. It would be hard to explain to the younger version of myself, because I think you do need boundaries in negotiating, and then it all can shift, and you have to be able to adapt to that and be respectful and keep North Stars, I think some people were mentioning, it's at the end of the day important. It is true, you really do have to remember that just because you don't get this interview does not necessarily ruin the story, and that's not the most important thing. And I guess I would just say that I think the hardest thing, in the context of the story we worked on, was for a while it's about a mass shooting, and I wanted to not ask anyone about it for a long time. The idea was it was just going to be about the aftermath of it. And I do think a lot of it's about the aftermath of it. But I had one of my editors was like, you're probably going to need to ask people about it eventually. And I kind of resisted. And then I think as delicately and through some many phone calls before the interviews and and some people and sussing out things, and people would change their mind even during the interview. We did do that, and that is actually the subject. The weird thing about this series of podcasts, there's 4 episodes. The first episode, which is here, is mostly about the day of the shooting. I think we've done it as respectfully as we could, but it was by far the one that resonated with people, including people at the paper, the most. And I don't totally know how to square those two things, because I do think you don't want to just just feast on that kind of the darkest parts of someone, but I do think you have to find a way to do it, and I do think you have to find a way to do it that involves asking new questions. So anyway, that's kind of a roundabout answer.
I'm going to follow up with you quick, because you did, I read that before your interviews, you would tell people kind of what subjects you were going to touch. You'd give people breaks, let them stop. You also decided not to name the shooter. Can you talk about those sort of craft decisions?
Yeah, and there's probably things I didn't think of, but we just tried to do most of the time, here's what I'm going to talk about, these topics. I didn't give people questions in advance, but it did feel right to say, okay, these are the things I want to hit on. Are you okay with that? Here, I don't know if it really does help, but I tried to give people examples of phrases they could use to pause or stop the interview, or jump okay, I want to jump past this, I'm not ready to, or I want to move on. People didn't use it that often, but sometimes they did. And then there were sometimes, one of the people I talked to was I will talk about everything that happened on the day of the shooting and after, but after, from the point which I was escorted out from the crime scene. I don't want to talk about before that. So that was like a negotiation. But I guess it made me think about the boundaries thing, because at the same time, when I interviewed her, it was all my questions were about after, but I couldn't. There were times that like she would mention something from the shooting, like you can't, you know what I mean? You can't totally like block that off. So it is always like a delicate balance.
I'd love to hear from Ed, who actually is a young journalist. I think he's got 40 years on me.
Yeah, trauma and kind of like the weight of what we cover is quite difficult. I feel like when I was younger, I was a lot more. It's a really weird balance, because when you're young and you're just starting out, you're really ambitious and you really just want to get the story, and you kind of like compartmentalize a lot. But then I think after reporting on tragedy after tragedy and conflict, your bucket just gets really full after a while. And when you get in trouble enough, you know, like Joe, you said, like shame, you start to blame yourself for all the times you either get attacked or get kidnapped or just get in trouble, and you think, oh shoot, did I screw up? And so I think the older you get, the more your past and everything kind of catches up with you. And it actually does make it really difficult. And I think especially in journalism, we don't talk about PTSD as much as we need to. Like, I find the older generation, like I'm in my 30s, but the older people, I was once told by an editor at the Times, if you feel like you're fucked up after Iraq, don't tell any single person, or else it will be a liability. And I, unfortunately, internalized that a lot. And I thought to myself, like, oh, shoot, this is not about me. And so it's really unhealthy. And we really do need to talk about how, you know, for the longest time, I would say to myself, like, I can't trespass on the grief of the people that we actually do cover. Like, what right do I have when I'm privileged enough to go into these places, get these testimonies, get these stories? I get to go home at the end of the day. I get to come here. I get to just live my life. And I would tell myself that for a really long time. But I think at some point in time, you just see enough and you're like, fuck, I don't know how to do this. And I think the starting out part of that is we need to open up that conversation amongst each other so that we can support each other, so that we can then have that empathy to project that onto our stories, onto our characters, onto the people that we cover. So I think that's what I'd say about that.
That is our mission. Oh yeah, go.
Yeah. Very nice, very beautiful what you say. Sí, yo iba un poco en ese sentido, que es, por un lado, realmente creo que trabajar sobre temas que te son importantes a ti.
I'm going more on that path, that when you're working on subjects that are very important to you,
Es decir, elegir temas y trabajar en caminos que para ti tienen sentido.
choosing subjects and choosing paths that for you make sense,
Más que porque sea la gran historia o porque es lo que, no sé.
more than it being a big story or whatever it is.
Y mucha paciencia para ir encontrando la forma que puede ser extremadamente cambiante.
And a lot of patience to be able to find the way or the form that can be extremely changing.
Y retomando la idea del compañero,
And retaking this idea of my colleague,
creo que es muy, yo empiezo a hablarlo ahora, que es la necesidad del autocuidado.
I think that now I'm starting to talk about, and it's the necessity that one has of you having your self-care.
Y eso también es colectivo, no es un trabajo solitario, tiene que ser compartido.
That's also as a group. It's not something that you do in solitude. It's something that has to be shared.
Eso.
So just that.
And if to talk directly to any students who are here, the one other thing that I promised myself I would say is, so I like an old line, I like, all journalists are thieves. We steal each other's story ideas, and we steal each other's writing style, and we, most importantly and obscenely, when prizes are awarded, we steal credit from each other, whatever. It's a great journalistic tradition. But so I'm going to steal a line from a colleague at the New York Times, and I want its profundity to be felt. And he said once, the New York Times is a place full of rules that don't exist. And if you just pause for a second and absorb that, right? We constrain ourselves by what we think we understand to be appropriate or ethical. And it's often, there is no decree somewhere, right? And God bless journalism schools, but I fear sometimes they set young people up with the idea that here are the rules, whatever, and you will abide by them or be constrained by them. Who the fuck said so? And in a real dramatic and embarrassing way for myself, when we won our freedom, we got out, and it was clear that a number of the migrants who we had interviewed had been subsequently detained and beaten as a consequence of them having cooperated with us. And it was Ian Urbina who had the decency and the clarity of thinking to say, oh, well, we need to help them. Whereas I'm sitting there, well, isn't there something about, well, wouldn't it compromise your objectivity about your subjects? Like, I literally was saying that to myself. I'm like, have I lost my mind? These are people, victims of crimes against humanity. Of course you should help them. And so Ian and Pierre Qatar, who was our videographer on the project, spent months sending money, engineering escapes. And so the 4 migrants who had been taken and abused and were at risk of being sent back into the detention centers made it home as a consequence of Ian and Pierre's work. And, you know, I hope it seems very straightforward to everybody here that that's what they should have done. But the idea that I, for a moment, thought, well, is this ethically appropriate? I'm embarrassed. But it is a rule that doesn't exist. So to the young people here, go out and break every one of the rules that don't exist.
Maybe not all of them. You know, there are some good ones. So I don't see anyone lined up at the Q&A, but maybe that's just because. Okay, cool. But Joe, did you have something to say in the meantime?
Yeah, regarding, I remember well being a young journalist. I think it's one of the things, especially in a newspaper, straight news organization, is they actually send the young people out. I mean, I saw more tragic situations as a 2-year, veteran, and you're completely unprepared for it. And there are these situations that I think the journalism community, I remember I got sent out to Alaska Air, crashed off the Ventura coast, and everyone died inside. And they said, hey, Joe, just go to the hotel where the parents are showing up and just try to get them right as they're walking in. And the parents were all coming in, and you could just see the obvious grief in their faces. And it was just, I was just like, no. I'm not going anywhere near those people. And I just called, so I tried. They wouldn't talk to me, but there was no way. And I remember feeling like a total failure. But then and then as more and more of these shootings happen, it's like, if they told me to go to Newtown or something, I'm not going to do that. There's too much of a swarm. It's not like when there was less journalists. And there is no way that's not traumatizing everyone in that community. And I don't know if there needs to be a situation where we have a pool of reporters that go in and file reports on behalf of the whole journalism, of the whole media or something, but it's these scrums are horrible. And the other thing as a young reporter, it's also very, because most reporting, you do need to be aggressive, actually. I mean, if you're talking to a public official or a corrupt official or a cop, or I can't just go up to Steve Bannon and say, oh, you don't want to tell your story, okay. I think so you have to you really have to, wear your kind of tough mask when you're dealing with certain people, and then really just kind of be a human when you're not, and especially in the tragic situations, they can sense a fake person coming up, and it's just you can just and you even feel yourself when you're being when they can sense your motive. I mean, I think you just be honest. Look, I want to tell your story, and usually they can sense that. I think, but it is hard to kind of draw the line between those kind of two types of reporters, I think.
Hi, thank you so much to all of you for all of your amazing reporting and everything you've been talking about here tonight. I have a question about verification when you're working with people who've survived this trauma, because on one hand, you don't want to be going into someone who's saying they've had all this trauma, interrogating them like you're saying, like you would a politician or something, tell me all these facts and get in there and relive this and everything. But on the other hand, you have some sort of journalistic responsibility to not just say, oh, everything that everyone says when they claim a trauma is true. Again, you mentioned the Rolling Stone story, and there are other examples of that. And I found when I've interviewed people who've, some of them have said these incredible stories of extreme trauma, and again, you don't want to get in and re-traumatize them, but you have to kind of find a way to figure out if this happened and how it happened and report on it responsibly. So just wondering how you guys deal with that.
I think the first thing you do is try to find anything that backs them up, you know, other people they've talked to, anything in the public record. It does get hard. Right now I'm an editor of a big team at the Los Angeles Times that's doing homeless, and homeless people will tell you lots of stories, and some of them are true, but they're very hard to confirm. So without offending them by interrogating them, you just try to find this ground where you can, you know, call people they know and get a sense, and use your own kind of instinct too. Is this doesn't sound right, or this doesn't make any sense, you know? I think that's the best you can do.
I can talk more unless people are sick of me, but which is quite probable. But I do that. I mean, just to take a case example. So in Libya, you know, it was extremely difficult to verify. We got to speak to very few migrants who had won their freedom from these detention centers. But for the single story we were telling of this young African migrant's shooting death inside al-Mabani, we were able to find a number of other people who were present. And so there was a consistency to their story. And then you can step back a little bit, and you know, over the years there had been much fine reporting that predated us about this crisis in North Africa. Italian journalists, Irish journalists, reporters for the Associated Press, and organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch had been there for years and inside these facilities and been able to document much of the same sorts of things that our individual victims were telling us. So that gives you a degree of consistency that, you know, they weren't there, but these are not fantastical stories, right? These are documented kinds of abuses going on. And when somebody is telling them to you, knowing full well that telling you anything damning that was done to them risks them paying yet a further price, I think it invests it with a certain authenticity that you can trust.
Actually, I just wanted to add something to that. So in the reporting side of it, when I was on this ship in the Mediterranean, a lot of people who, you know, intersected, they had cell phone footage of some of these atrocities that would happen, and so they would happily, you know, give it to me, and kind of like through that you can also forensically verify a lot of things and look at the geolocation of where things are shot. So I found it to be really strange because you would kind of interview them as like a human being and have this empathy, but kind of in the back of your head going like, I do need to make sure this is consistent. And so you're kind of like wearing two hats at the same time, and it gets a little strange, but I think if you just kind of like, it's not like you're interrogating, but you're just kind of like just making sure that everything is right by asking both the emotional and then the technical questions, it kind of just adds up sometimes, and you just need to use your instincts kind of like that.
Thank you.
My main question is actually on what do each of you do for you had mentioned self-care, right? So my main question is, I'd love to know that. But two of you mentioned anecdotes. One, Joe, you had mentioned the 30-year-old. My basic question, did he make it or no?
Yeah, he made it.
He did.
Was intubated and he made it, yeah.
Wow. Well,
that's amazing. Yeah.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
And then you had mentioned the 4 migrants, Ian helped get them home. Was home where they were originally from, or was it Europe? Did they get to Europe?
Yeah, so it varied. One we were able to get, Ian and Pierre, because I want to give full credit to them, and they both shared in the James Foley Award for Courage or whatever, and it was mostly on, as a consequence of their work in saving these, and I think it's offensive, it's my offense, whatever, calling them migrants, whatever, these, these men. And so one made it all the way back to the Ivory Coast, which is where he was from. At least 2 or 3 made it to Europe. And Pierre, who was based in Rome, was able to assist them further once they got to Italy. So those two, Ian and Pierre, just remarkable human beings. So it was a good outcome for them. Although Pierre might regret it. I think one of them is a house guest a little too often now. But
Fair enough. So thank you both. And yes, would love to hear sort of what your self-care is or what you would recommend while doing the reporting and perhaps after as well. Or do you do self-care?
I would just say the one thing that you need to know about trauma, and I'm talking about in the context of us as journalists, is that it's called post-traumatic stress for a reason. And I think a lot of times, like, I know to myself, like, whatever I just experienced, it's not going to hit me for like a year from now. And just knowing that it doesn't, like, things take time for them to really hit you from behind. And so I think it's really important to kind of just like, talk to your colleagues. I, have a therapist, and actually Bruce Shapiro has been incredibly helpful for me in kind of like understanding just how to deal with all these things that we've seen. And I'm not saying I have any answers, but I think just being able to have open conversations about kind of the things that we've seen and understanding that we're human too is really important. And I wish I had the finals.
Sí, yo creo que, bueno, el terapeuta así como de básico.
I think a therapist does something basic.
Pero después, por lo menos en Latinoamérica, empieza a haber grupos, sobre todo de mujeres.
But after that, especially in Latin America, there are groups, especially of women.
No siempre periodistas.
They're not always journalists.
Abogadas, activistas.
Attorneys, activists.
Que empiezan a poner en conjunto sus experiencias.
They start to bring together their experiences.
Y termina siendo no sé qué cosa extraña.
And it ends up being, I don't know what strange thing.
Pero son intentos, ¿no? Como buscar caminos para no estar sola o
But
solo.
it's the intention of trying to find a path of not being alone.
Entonces creo que no hay un formato, sino hay que buscar.
So I don't think there's only one format. You just have to look, you have to seek, you have to keep looking.
Yeah, I covered I was in Haiti like a day after the earthquake, and just the horror of that was incomprehensible. And I found the best way was not to completely shut myself off to it as I was witnessing it, and really use writing stories in a way to be somewhat of a catharsis. It did kind of just, it comes back. I didn't go see a therapist. But I did talk to people about it, and just I think a lot of talking about it. And then and I'm not like a war correspondent, so I'm not going back and back and back to other situations like that. So I feel like I was able to kind of cope with that one situation without just being thrust into another one. But yeah, I think talking, it's just the only way. Talking in time.
Can I just add something, Joe? I think I find a lot of journalists, we compare our experiences to other journalists. And hearing you say, I'm not a war correspondent, to me, I really don't like that idea that you have to, like, first off, the idea of a war correspondent doesn't exist, and anyone who calls themselves that is an asshole. Like, what does that mean? What is a war correspondent? Like, you only work when there's a war? Like, what?
So I wasn't calling you an asshole, though.
No. But I think just within journalism, we have to set up, I think it's important to set up an expectation that every trauma that you experience is valid. Regardless of where you are. And I think a lot of times we compare ourselves to like, well, I didn't cover this, so therefore what right do I have? And I feel that a lot, and I feel that a lot for myself, which is like, what right do I have to feel anything when, I wasn't kidnapped in Libya, but other bad things have happened too. And in a lot of conversations I've had with journalists, in times that we've gotten in trouble, people will say to me, like, well, I didn't go through what you went through. But my answer is, you know what, it doesn't matter. Like, we've all been through some crazy stuff because that's just what we do. And I think the start of that is to stop comparing our experiences, because all that does is then invalidate our own. For example, like when I was working in the Middle East, like James Foley was a friend. And for a long time, I kept on thinking to myself, well, that didn't happen to me, so what right do I have? And so I moved to the States. I spent a long time trying to think to myself, like, well, what right do I have to feel anything, any trauma about what I saw in the Middle East, because I wasn't executed on the internet. And that stopped me from being able to deal with decades of trauma. And I think we do that to ourselves, and we should not do that.
Sí, just to finish, yo creo que justo el tema de que creo que el periodismo está cambiando en ese sentido, pero el periodista con la historia que ha vivido más, no sé, más sufrimiento o ha visto más guerra.
I believe that the story of journalism and the reporter is changing because this story of the journalist seeing more wars.
Como muchas veces el hombre como que puede con todo, ¿no?
A lot of times, like the man can deal with everything.
Creo que hay que desconstruir eso urgentemente.
I think that has to be deconstructed urgently.
Y también entender que nuestros amigos, nuestra familia,
And understand that our families, our friends,
a veces no quieren escuchar esas historias.
sometimes they don't want to listen to these stories.
Entonces hay que encontrar otros espacios
So we have to find other spaces
para cuidarnos, ¿no?
to take care of ourselves.
We have time for, if you can both just ask those questions back to back, then we'll take them up here as they come. Thanks.
Okay.
Unless Lisa, you're in line too. Okay, we'll do one question and then the next two back to back. So you have question time.
Okay, so I'm a psychology student, master's student, and my questions are answered with self-care and mental health and speaking about vicarious trauma and PTSD, but I'm interested in the intersection of journalism and being a therapist. I'm training to be one. So do you have suggestions on how I can connect both the dots and work in an intersectional field which combines both? Yeah.
I can answer that question pretty straightforwardly if it's helpful. We launched a project called the Journalist Trauma Support Network, where we're training therapists on how to work effectively with journalists. A lot about journalism culture. We actually started training the second cohort today. So if you stick around after, that might be the easiest solution.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have, and the next question. Thanks. Sorry.
Thank you much. Thank you all so much for speaking with us. Something I've thought a lot about is the fact that when we go in to write about someone who has experienced trauma, we often end up defining them by their trauma, and that becomes the image of them that the world sees. And so I'm curious how you think about that in your own work and how you maybe attempt to mitigate that effect and to kind of work against that narrative construction that this person is only defined by the worst day of their life, when in reality they have much more to give to the world.
Mm-hmm.
I would just say it's like as simple as time and space, which sounds really almost trite, but like time with the person so you get to see that. And then space, making space in the story for that. And I don't think it's always going to be like a 50-50, but like finding a way to have that space. It also makes the story better, I think.
Claire?
I was just saying, curiosity, like asking them the questions. I think that's part of what made Rita's project unique, because these events, these instances of police violence have been covered over and over again, and there's so much you can read about them and watch about them. But she really wanted to do something different. So I think just she had the curiosity, and she went in with that as the guiding compass. So I think if you do that, you will automatically sort of end up giving time and space.
And I think that one of the things is find ways to come back to them. You know, they're going to be this character defined by this terrible thing, likely, and that's why you're writing about them. And but you know, you can revisit them and their progress or recovery or not. And, you know, any additional writing about them humanizes them in all sorts of new and important ways. So, you know, it takes a lot of discipline and sometimes even working against the inclinations of editors to say, like, you know, we did that. We know that story. So go back. It's always a good piece of advice. Even if it doesn't result in a story, you know, stay in touch with them.
Thank you all.
I think this is our last question.
Sorry, no pressure, right? This is for Joe, and it's actually about a very small slice of the process, but a part that I think is important. And you said that you began by following 7 people and then profiled 3. And when people give us the time and share their stories with us, and then we inevitably sometimes make that choice that they're not going to be in the piece, I'm just curious how you handled that in that particular situation, telling them.
Well, some of it was just logistical. One person was transferred to another hospital where we got no access to him anymore. Another person pretty much just soured on us being around, I think. And we were fine with that. I can't remember how we lost. It's kind of now a fog. But there was no, because basically the first story, which was kind of the beginning of the series, was about 2 people. And then the third guy that we'd really gotten close to, he kind of just stayed about the same, and then he kind of slowly got better. But then his story was amazing. And then we talked to him for so long, I turned that into his story. He just about being in his bed for 2 months, and he's like, but he's hearing his life fall apart. His wife's telling him, you know, they can't pay for their cars, they can't pay for this, like he's going to lose his job. The plumbing's all is clogged. What do I do? Because he took care of everything in the house, and he's just, and then his brother died of COVID, and he was pissed at his wife for even telling him, because his own health just went plummeting. So then, anyway, so that person had such a compelling, like, internal story. That was the second story that we did.
That sounds great, yeah.
So yeah, that's how.
So you didn't have to really tell anybody.
I didn't tell anyone. Yeah, there was no one that was like great.
But it's a great question, and if the example of Joe doesn't fit it, it's worthy of, you know, trying to wrestle with. And a thought just occurred to me. I don't know of what value, but I mean, one of the things is, you know, if you've spent that much time with them, you've heard their story, is you can write it for them, you know, and because they're really not, their sense of, I think, whatever satisfaction or relief or whatever in telling their story, this doesn't really hinge on it being on the front page of the New York Times. If you can give them, you know, something that they can carry with them, whether they share it with their family or their spouse or their children, or, you know, I think you can do that, and it will have value for them. And, you know, I think the degree of heartbreak that they didn't make it into the piece can be conquered.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone, for these great questions. And join me in thanking Chris, Joe, Claire, Zahara, Sonia, Joe, and Ed. Thank you all. I think the bar is still open. Yeah? Okay, so feel free to grab a drink. And I'm sure if we didn't get to questions, they can answer them.